Chapter 11, Removing the Guard. In this chapter, we're going to learn ingenious ways, to remove the defenders of various chess pieces. In doing so, we cut off the support from these pieces. We cut their communications with their lines of support and make them more vulnerable to capture. Let's see how this works in practice. In this first example, it is white to move. At first, there's nothing obvious to do. We could play queen takes queen, but then king simply takes back. The bishop could take the knight, but the rook would take back. There's nothing obviously hanging. However, this is where we learn an important idea in regards to removing the guard. It is the notion of playing a move such as rook g7 check. This apparent sacrifice of the rook really forces the king away from the queen. We've removed the guard of the queen and allows our own queen now to capture the black queen with a check. Now, after the king moves again, we can also take the knight. The main point of this example is this pattern where we can distract a particular piece away from its responsibility in guarding another piece. Let's see this particular idea through various other examples. In this example, it is again white to move. And once again, it seems as though everything is defended from the black perspective. We can't take the rook because it's defended by the queen. And we can't simply take the knight because it's also defended by the king. But we can remove the guard of this rook by playing the move rook to e7. This distracts the black queen. And it might seem at first like the queen takes our rook and now we take the black rook. But here we combine the previous weapon of a double attack. We've taken a rook, but we've also done it with a check that also forks the remaining rook. So in combining the double attack with the idea of removing the guard, we come up with this combination rook e7, which attacks the queen. The queen cannot move simply away somewhere, for then the same fate would befall the rooks, and the knight would also be under terrible distress. So the queen really has to take, but that allows us to regather a rook with check and a double attack on the other rook. Now, let's see more examples of this because it is a tricky concept to master. In this third example, it's actually black's turn to move. And here we have an immediate sort of instinct to play bishop d5, which skewers the queen, and if the queen moves anywhere other than g4, then we'll be able to take the bishop behind it, essentially removing the defender of the bishop. However, the queen here still is in contact with the bishop, so our job is not yet done. We need to continue to harass this queen, and we need to be careful about how we do it. If we simply play f5, attacking the queen again, we give white the opportunity to insert the intermediate move bishop takes bishop check. And once we capture back, then we've given white an opportunity to move their queen away. Instead, we would need here to play h5 to harass this queen. There's only one more square for the queen where it stays in contact with the bishop. That's f4. But from there, we can take the queen, removing the defender of the bishop. This example is actually quite complicated because white can recapture with the e-pawn, thus reinstating another defender of the bishop. Here, black is still a lot better because after the bishop trade, although there's even material, black's pawns are much better and black's rook is much more active. After rook d1 check, which forces the king to g2, black can play rook to b1, and this pawn is doomed. Black's going to have a pass pawn and a winning position. But all of that is just to illustrate the idea of harassing a piece away from the piece that it guards, and doing so in a safe manner. In this case, it's quite a complicated scenario, but as we go on, we're going to see simpler scenarios, and the complex scenarios will become apparently more simple to us. In this example, it is white to move. Can you see any violent moves that will remove defenders and leave other pieces undefended? Any ways to cut the support that certain pieces have? Well, here we combine the idea of a discovered attack with the idea of removing the guard. The discovered attack is that we have a queen, a long-range piece, and a rook, both staring at this particular knight. And this interposing piece can jump away in such a way as to remove the guard of the knight. After black recaptures, that knight is a sitting duck, and we can capture it. Let's advance further. In this example, it is white to move. The first thing to notice is that the black queen is the only thing defending the black rook. White has at their disposal the move queen to g4 check, which also attacks the queen, and therefore obligates the queen to capture this queen, thereby abandoning the defense of the rook. This will give white an opportunity to take the rook as an intermediate move before recapturing the queen, because it can take the rook with check, forcing black to move the king and thereby getting one extra move to capture the queen. Let's see the way that looks. Queen to g4, check. If the king moves away, then we're going to win the queen over here. That is why the black queen must take our queen. But instead of just taking the queen back immediately, which would be a giant blunder, we play rook takes rook check first. We insert this intermediate move, forcing the black king to deal with the check, and only then do we take the queen. All of a sudden, we have an overwhelming material advantage. Let's see the action replay. This has all come about because we've removed the guard of the rook. We've also combined it with the idea of an intermediate move, which is not something that is actually covered in this book explicitly, but we do come across it implicitly. In this example, it's black to move. Looking at violent moves often involves a hierarchy of looking at all the possible checks and all the possible captures and all the possible threats of checks and threats of captures. If we start here by looking at our possible checks, especially one that involves a capture, we would begin our analysis with an analysis of a rook takes bishop check. One thing to note about that is that it would remove one of the defenders of the knight. Also, if the king responds by capturing our rook, which is the only conceivable move, then that king would be on a square that is attackable from our bishop. We could play bishop takes knight, check, which also happens to hit the rook over here. If we wanted to force further trades first, we could play rook takes check And after king takes, we could play queen takes knight, check. And then only after either the queen recaptures and we do another check before winning the rook, or the king moves away and we take the queen, forcing a recapture of the queen, and then we take the rook. Let's see how this looks on the board. Rook takes g2, check. King takes g2. Bishop takes knight, check. King moves away, and we move to win the rook. Let's move on to the next example. In this one, it's white to move. And again, there's nothing particularly obvious in this position. It does look as though this pawn here on g5 is undefended and can be taken. And indeed, that could be something worth considering. But we don't just play the first move that comes to our mind. We start going through the hierarchy of violent moves. We think about all the checks and all the captures, including the ones that look ridiculous. We consider queen takes pawn, but after the king takes queen, we don't have much in way of follow-up. We can play rook to h7 check to follow up, and then we can bring the other rook in to support the first rook, but there's not enough firepower there to really win the game. We can also consider the move rook h7 check to start with. In that case, assuming that the king takes our rook, we can then play queen takes f7 check. And this, with our queen controlling these squares, forces the king either to h6 or to h8. And in either of those cases, we can bring our other rook across to the h-file, and we have what looks like a deadly attack. In fact, it is. We play rook h7, removing the king and its guard, or its guarding ability, away from the f7 pawn. So once it takes our rook, we take that pawn with check. All of a sudden, we have that black king cornered. We can use our other rook to swoop in, and after a simple block, it's checkmate. Out of nowhere, these positions seem to explode when you have the correct weapons at your disposal. In this case, we have an example where we want to be able to land a knight fork very instinctively. We want to hit this knight fork that hits the rook and also hits the bishop. But let's think about what makes this move actually so strong. What makes it strong is that once the rook saves itself by moving somewhere, we can then take the bishop, the rook will recapture, and at that point, the knight here will have lost all of its defenders and we'll be able to win that knight. Let's see this play out. Knight b6, attacking the rook. Rook moves, attacking our knight. But now we simply take the bishop, and once the rook recaptures, we take the en-prise knight. Let's continue moving now. This is a similar example. This time it's black to move, and once again, we naturally note, since there are no checks available to start off with, nor any captures other than the bishop capture of the pawn, which is easily refuted, we have threats to capture. In particular, we have the threat of knight c4 threatening this rook and the bishop here. Once the rook saves itself, we will be able to capture this bishop, and once the rook captures our knight, again, here is an undefended knight. We play knight c4, the rook moves, we take the bishop, and then the knight. In this position, it is white to move. Seems very complicated at first, but we can break it down through systematic thought. The first thought is that this knight is defended primarily by the pawn, and we can get rid of that pawn by playing d takes e5. Now, black has two ways to potentially recapture here. One is with the bishop and one is with the queen. note that if the bishop recaptures, then the bishop will be the only defender of the knight, which we attack twice, and we would then be able to win that knight. Therefore, black is more or less forced to recapture with the queen, thereby maintaining two defenders of this knight. The key to this position is therefore the fact that we can now remove one of those two defenders by playing knight takes bishop. This is an even trade. However, because the bishop no longer exists, supporting the queen and supporting the knight, the queen now stands alone in its support of the knight, and we can overpower that queen by using our queen and bishop. In so doing, we've won a lot of material. In this position, it is again white to move. We have a couple of ways to demonstrate the concept of remove the guard in this example. One way relies on something similar to what we saw in the first example. We can start with the violent move bishop takes knight check, which forces the queen to recapture. And then, rather than just trading queens, we can borrow from that earlier idea, and we can remove the only guard of the queen by playing rook h8 check, forcing the king away from the queen, and then we can come and take that queen, and we have a winning position. That is one beautiful idea. There is another way to do this though, perhaps a simpler way. We can start with f3. Now, the queen could escape out to d7, but that leaves the knight completely undefended and proves the point of removing the guard. If the queen tries to stay in the vicinity of the knight, we can hit that queen again, and now it has no safe squares to go to at all. Instead, it gives itself up. We take it, black recaptures, and then we recapture. This is a moot point because white is absolutely, overwhelmingly winning here, but I'll show a couple more moves here for the sake of demonstrating the concept again. Let's say black plays e4, we take the pawn. Black plays b5. What's the simplest way to win here? Well, it's to take away this knight off the board so that we can just very easily and casually create another queen. How can we take this knight off the board? Well, one way, of course, is just to literally take it and swap it for our queen. We still have a very winning position, but a stronger way to do it, and a way that demonstrates the idea of removing the guard, is rook to h8 check. The knight can't move because it's pinned to the king. Therefore, the king has to move, and we've eliminated the knight, held onto our queen, and of course, this position is a very easy checkmate. In this position, it is white to move, and this is a very nice position, easy enough to calculate. How can we remove the guard and win material? Well, we start by looking at violent moves, and one of the moves we see is the check with our knight. This check forces the king to either move to b8 or d8. Let's say b8. If it goes to b8, we can take the knight with check again. And once our knight is recaptured, we've removed the guard of the queen and can take the queen. Alternatively, had the king gone to d8, the exact same tactic exists. We can play knight takes knight, removing the guard of the queen, and doing so with check, forcing black to recapture us and then allowing us to win the queen. If, however, black does not want to move their king, the only other option is to take our knight with their knight, but that also abandons defense of the queen. We have successfully removed the guard. In this position, it is white to move. Have a little think here. about what you would play if you were in white's position. This position relies on the combination of two of our weapons. One of them is the double attack, and the other is removing the guard. Firstly, the double attack. It's a violent move starting with bishop takes pawn, check. It's both a check and a capture. When the king moves, we're in a position now whereby our bishop can remove the defender of the dark squared bishop. We play bishop takes knight, and after black recaptures, we play rook takes bishop, and we have an overwhelming material advantage with which we should be able to win the game. In this position, it is a similar idea. We're trying to remove the guard. We have some beautiful bishops and may be hesitant to give them up in general, but in this specific position, we see that we have a very vulnerable bishop here, vulnerable to our rook. It's true that the bishop is currently defended by two different knights, but we can play violent moves to get those knights out of the way. The first move would be bishop takes knight, essentially forcing the recapture. The second move would be g5. And now, one of these two minor pieces has to fall. In this example, it is white to move. This is a beautiful example, and I'm going to explain it as best I can. We see that the black king is very much in the center of the board. We can't simply take the queen because the knight here will recapture our queen, and that's a relatively equal trade. We're probably still winning there just because of the amount of force we have concentrated in the center of the board, all coming at this uncastled king. It's highly likely we're going to have a lethal attack brewing here. But we could also think specifically about removing the guard rather than just taking the queen and allowing him to recapture. What if we remove the guard of the queen by playing bishop takes knight? If we play bishop takes knight, we're threatening to take the queen, and it's true we're allowing him to take our queen as well. But in taking our queen, he gives up control of the e1 square and allows our rook to come and occupy that square with check. From there, there's really only a couple moves that he can do. He can give the queen back, which is futile, or he can interpose this bishop onto e7. Remember, we have a rook on the e-file and we have a bishop on c5, which means we can play rook takes e7, check, forcing the king here, and then we can finish him off with a checkmate. Let's see the way that works. Here's a violent move, taking a piece and threatening to win a queen. So he cannot simply take back the piece. He has to deal with the safety of his queen, and he can't resist taking our own. But now we have rook e1, check. He can interpose his queen for what it's worth. It isn't worth very much anymore. We give another check. He plays bishop e7. We play another check. His king is forced here. And now there's a checkmate with rook d8. In this example, it's white to move. And once again, we want to think about removing the defender. Here, black has this queen that's defended only by the knight. So from that observation comes the idea of bishop takes knight. Now, we actually defend our own queen whilst we've taken away the defense of black's queen. Black trades queens, but on some, we've won a knight. In this position, again, it's white to move, and we need to think of a forceful way to remove the defender, remove the guard. We do that in this example by noting that the only defender of the black rook is this pawn, and we can remove it forcefully by knight takes pawn. check. Here we've won a pawn, and now, although black will take our knight, we're free to take the rook, i.e. we win an exchange in addition to the pawn. That's a lot of material, and it should be enough to win us the game. In this position, it is black to move. This is similar to the first example where we used the rook to remove the guard from the queen. We've seen that idea a couple of times now. Now we're seeing it again in a different conception. This time we're going to remove the guard by using our light squared bishop. We play the move bishop to c2, check. This distracts the king, and whether the king moves away anywhere near the queen, if it were possible to do that, our bishop would be able to take the queen, or our queen would, supported by the bishop. And if the king takes our bishop, as it is practically forced to do, then he has abandoned the defense of his queen, and we swoop in and take it. In this position, it's black to move. And again, we see a similar motif. How do we play here to win material by removing the guard? The answer here is rook g1, check, forcing the king away from its queen so that we can then use our own queen to capture the white queen. That concludes the chapter on removing the guard. We are adding steadily more and more pieces of weaponry to our armamentarium. The next one is going to be a keen awareness of pieces that have no retreat. We'll see you then.